So, according to NBC Chicago, anti-Asian crimes rose 73% in 2020. And Asians are also the ones who have long been treated differently in the U.S. society. So what do you think the main reasons could be from your maybe professional point of view or individually? Both, okay.
Sure. So you've kind of mentioned this a little bit in your question as well, that, Asians have Asian communities, I would say, have a history of being treated differently or socially marginalized in US society. And not Asian communities alone, because if you see or trace it historically, as we've seen in the history of immigration to this country, which of course is ironic given that this country as we know it now is made up of immigrants. And, it's so common, this knowledge, or rather it should be so common that it's almost become like a pop culture metaphor, right? Because when we talk about this country, or when othering happens, or when racist acts take place, or when dominant cultures decide to marginalize other communities who look different, or talk in different languages, or present appear different as well, physically and in other ways. It's very ironic because the path rather that their families, or rather their forefathers or ancestors also took to come and settle in this country was via immigration as well, right? I mean, whether it was forcefully done, whether it was not involuntary, it also happened that because they weren't the original inhabitants of the country. The original inhabitants of the country were Native American people, right? Indigenous people who were also, as we know, historically sort of subject to one of the largest recorded genocides, right? In the history of the world. They were driven out, they were killed in hundreds and thousands. They were dispossessed from their own lands. And look at where some of those communities are now, or what they have dwindled down to, or the circumstances under which they have to live in certain reservations. So I think to start from there, it is different communities over time have been treated differently. And yes, of late, we have seen, particularly because we have just sort of grappled with some of the fallouts of the pandemic, and not just in terms of health and the number of lives lost, but because anytime something big like this happens, including the pandemic, it also brings out a lot of social ills, a lot of cultural problems and issues, right? A lot of economic implications, or even religious othering. So much also happens as a result of that. And going back to, how Asians have been treated or marginalized differently among, other populations, that went all the way back to, I think somewhere maybe the late 1700s, but think about the late 1800s and the early 20th century. Like you had the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? I think that was of 1882, I believe. And later, even the I think the Johnson-Reed Act or the Immigration Act of 1924, where a large number of people coming in from Asian countries were cut down. That quota was cut down. They were not really allowed entry into the United States because this national origins quota was put into place. They called it national origins, but it was it was a move to further marginalize, this particular community, and to further create immobile situations for people from different Asian countries to come in. And as we have talked about this before too, that when we talk about mobility or human mobility, it's not just a process that happens, or not just something that happens, because of globalization, but it is a right. It's a fundamental human right, the right to mobility, right? And when those in power, whether they're colonial powers or settler colonials, or even the host society, who sort of who 50% mitigate the host and migrant relationship, it becomes a huge thing, right? So I think historically, of course, there is precedence for it, for Asians who have, first of all, being limited into coming in, and then they have been treated differently. Because if you see a lot of Asian communities, even when they came in, even in the mid 20th century, they talk about how they were enclaved almost. They had to create their own spaces away from the other larger, spaces of settlement, within cities and all of that. So they, in order to survive, they had to create, their own workspaces, their own businesses. So for example, now we celebrate a lot of these enclaves, or we say, oh, how amazing, I really look forward to going to Chinatown and trying some of their food, or I really look forward to going into Little India, trying food there, or oh, let's go to Koreatown, and I really want to have X, Y, and Z. So what has now become celebratory, or become sort of a celebrated part of the city, was always a part of the economic narrative, right? These communities were always contributing, but they were still marginalized. They were still othered, right? And there were signs. I remember when, we were studying about this, or rather even when sometimes I teach about, these little, let's say, pockets in history, and then connect it to a lot of what we see happening now. We've seen images from news media at the time that literally, I still remember, I'll never forget, there was this one black and white sketch, probably from a newspaper in the 1920s, or even before, maybe late 18th century, late 19th century, where you have this sketch of an Asian presenting, perhaps Chinese presenting person in traditional clothing, sort of sitting on a roadside curb with a sign that said that something like Chinese not allowed, or dogs in Chinese not allowed, and things like that. So, and I have seen similar images like that in when I was in India, and I was studying Indian history, where India was also colonized by the British for many years, right? So a couple of centuries, in fact, and I've seen similar images, archived images that came out in papers and things, and even outside, certain buildings, government buildings, clubs and things, where it was clearly written Indians and dogs not allowed. And this was in India, this was in their space, which sort of the, colonial powers that be at the time, they came and did that. So it resonated with me. And I was like, look at the amount of, and yes, we're talking about a different period in history, but the legacy of that was so hard to forget. And it's so strong, carrying on. And of course, things have changed a lot. A lot of, we're living in a very different situation now, where, as I said, we're still lucky to live in a time where we see a lot of representation happening. We are a lot more in numbers. We don't have restrictions of people coming in, at least from our countries of national origin. But maybe somewhere a lot of that, kind of compounds and builds up and creates, maybe in some people's minds, some kind of a prejudice that then, they carry out. Like this example of the Eileen Gu controversy that, we talked about. Because, Hannah, people are quick to judge. And we've often talked about that, right? We talked about how it's important in order to build communication competence, particularly intercultural communication competence, it is really important to kind of take a step back from your own cultural location and then look at not just what others are doing, but also like kind of reevaluate what you are doing, or what kind of cultural blinders, you yourself, or rather we ourselves have put on. I'm sure we will find in all of us, even from our own cultural or bicultural locations, certain prejudices. I'm sure we also have, over time. And And especially, I think, people are quick to judge when we are faced with cultural contexts or people who are different, whether we call it culture shock, within our own spaces, or reverse culture shock, whether we just call it unfamiliarity or xenophobia, which is a much more extreme version of it, or some milder form of ethnocentrism. I think these factors are there in us, in a lot of us, but how we choose to fight against it, or how we choose to sort of put that aside and give credit to an individual for their experiences and what they bring, or the richness they bring, I think is what is, I think, really important, for us to think about and even to do going forward. So, as I said, that I think a lot of the reasons that you say that, why people have been treated differently, including people in the Asian communities, is other than the history, a lot of the Asians also on a very surface level, we look different. And I'm being very open and honest about it. A lot of us look very different. We present differently physically. We talk a lot of different languages. Our food customs are probably very different as well, right? Think about it. Even regionally, our food customs are so different. I'm talking about India. If I go from north to south, there is such stark difference. We have some 26, 28 languages official that are spoken. Sometimes I feel that how good of an Indian am I? I just probably know 3 Indian languages and that's about it. But then that's just the way the makeup is, right? I'm sure, think about, mainland China as well, or the regional and linguistic differences there. I'm sure even with the, 3 or 4 or more specific languages that are spoken, there are maybe hundreds and hundreds of dialects or regional variations that, you may face if you go from one region to the other, even within the same space, forget north and south, and differences in taste, in customs, in culture. A lot of us practice different religions. I think that's another factor. Particularly in the US, I think that has been a point of contention for non-Christian communities to kind of be sort of at the receiving end of a lot of this kind of prejudice, right? Because a lot of what we do also brings in cultural and religious and ethnic unfamiliarity for the dominant, or has over time for the dominant group. And of course, I think presently, China is, with its sort of power at this point of time, it's really rising. It has become a major player in the sort of global economy and in other areas. So, and of course, there are a lot of other issues that are, I'm sure, and again, no country is perfect, right? I'm sure there are a lot of social and other issues and controversies and ills in our Asian countries as well. I know there's a lot I'm extremely critical about in India that is happening, on different levels, on the religious levels, on tolerance levels, on many other levels that I don't identify with. There are a lot of things happening in India now that I don't identify with being a person of Indian origin. I'm sure, you could also say the same from, there are some things you identify with and some things you don't, right? So, but that's the story everywhere. But I think what happens here is, particularly because it has translated very sadly to people not being, or finding a scapegoat to blame their problems on. At this point of time, it has been the Asian Americans ever since the pandemic, which is why I think we see this, Asian crime, the rate of crimes against Asian Americans rise up so much. And, because they decided they needed a community to blame, and they've done that. Think about, what happened after 9/11, right? Where there was so much of Middle East and anti-Asian also, crimes at that point of time, particularly anyone who presented as someone from, certain countries or certain locations, or a brown person for that matter. So there were so many people who had no connection to whatever was happening, whether, from national context or cultural context. But I remember reading this article where people from the Sikh Indian community, and Sikhism is a religion as well, right? And a lot of the people who follow Sikhism, the men in particular, they wear turbans as part of their religious kind of following, right? But there are so many people, there's so many hate crimes against them, so many people who were attacked. Their places of business and shops and things were completely broken down. Some were killed as a result of hate crimes, because those who did it assumed that that person was Middle Eastern. First of all, that itself is so wrong. Just because someone is from somewhere doesn't mean that they're automatically associated with something negative that is happening, right? So the work, but that's what we have seen, that the ill work of a few individuals gets sort of burdened on the entire community, just because they are from the same cultural or whatever background, right? So I think here again, I think that this state in rise, and then of course we have movements like #StopAsianHate, which I'm very glad there are a lot of community leaders, particularly in the Asian American community. I have seen a lot of that happening in the Chicagoland as well. I know there were some rallies and informational sessions, I think particularly in Chinatown, where certain community leaders in the Asian American community took a stand, and they talked about ways to kind of fight against it, to mitigate it. But also online, we've seen digital activism, or rather digital advocacy movements around #StopAsianHate. Or like even before all of this happened, like you had, I'm forgetting her name now, but the founder of Not Your Asian Sidekick, and that was more about being misrepresented in media and in other walks of life, or lack of representation. So over time, we've had these different controversies and these different problems related to cultural othering that we have faced as an Asian community. Sadly, I feel now, everything that's happening is just sort of like a legacy, and it sort of historically that is carried on. And I'm really hoping that, we'll soon, people will see sense, and there will soon be an end to all of this.
I received a lot of information, and as we are almost at the end of the interview, do you have anything to add on? It's fine if you don't.
Yeah, I think, a lot of these questions, because they bring up, there's no right or wrong answer, right? When you ask open questions like that. So I think there are a lot of this, I would say I brought up, what should happen or what I would like to see happen in the last one or two questions, I think that I addressed. So yeah, I don't think anything specifically I would like to, add on, other than saying that, just people need to be a little bit more, they need to be more accepting in fact and in reality, and not just on pen and paper, and not just to kind of show that we're woke. If we really are woke, then we need to kind of do something practically sort of about it, right? But yes, I mean, again, don't quote me on that woke term, because again, I don't want to culturally appropriate. That's not something that is culturally a part of our thing. But definitely, I would say that we need to be more conscientious. We need to be more culturally mindful and conscientious, and really give people credit for their own decisions, because it all comes from their life's experiences and their own what they are comfortable with, culturally speaking. So I think a lot of this misunderstandings that we have can be addressed in more matured ways when something like this happens. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I'm gonna stop
Very welcome
right now.
Okay.